Are you a small business owner looking to refresh your brand copy, perhaps in the form of your website bio, blog posts, or general online content? If you are, then you need to download my free resource, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV. This is a collection of some of my best writing tips and tricks, all of which I learned from covering television. As an added bonus, you'll be automatically subscribed to my email list where you can learn more about my writing services and receive weekly updates about my podcast, Emotional Abuse is Real. Head over to the link in the show notes to grab 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV today. Trigger warning, this podcast episode features discussions of emotional abuse and suicidal ideation. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Leeds. I'm a professional writer and storyteller, and I'm so glad you're here. Today's episode is going to be a little different, as I'm going back to the style of the podcast's early episodes. It's just me, a microphone, and a story. But as always, before we get into the episode, I have a few quick announcents. Please make sure you're following me on Instagram at Sarene Leeds Writes. That's SareneLeedsWrites. And that you're subscribed to this podcast on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Also, don't forget to support Emotional Abuse is Real by leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review over on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you're interested in being a guest on Emotional Abuse is Real, you can always either DM me on Instagram, email me at hello@SareneLeedsWrites.com, or you can fill out my quick and simple application form. I've left links to my Instagram, email, the show's application form, and my free download in the show notes. On today's episode, I'm going to share a personal emotional abuse story that I don't talk about that much publicly. Mainly because this experience hasn't affected me as deeply as my time at Rolling Stone, and because there's a family component involved. In full transparency, most people involved would prefer that I just get over what happened to me and to not discuss it at all. And that's all the more reason why I feel compelled to speak out. I'm not out to hurt anyone, but I truly feel that the more I keep silent about this matter, the longer everyone's pain will endure. So, without further ado, here's my story. Today, I'm going to talk about something that happened to me about 16 years ago. For the sake of privacy, I won't mention any names, but it is difficult to tell this story without explaining that when I say, quote, family, I mean my husband's family. Ironically, it's the word family that set off the verbal abuse that I experienced by someone who I actually never considered family. Since I refuse to refer to this person as my brother-in-law, I will call him my sister-in-law's husband, because that's who he is. So back in 2008, my then fiance and I were at a birthday party for his sister. We were all enjoying ourselves when an older gentleman roughly bumped into me and didn't even acknowledge what had happened before walking away. My initial reaction was, as you could expect, a confused one. The gentleman in question was, okay, stay with me here, my fiance's sister's husband's dad, aka the father of the man I now call my sister-in-law's husband. Another woman who had witnessed the incident laughed it off and told me, he's family. But the problem was I couldn't agree with that assessment because this person didn't even bother to look at me or say something like, "Oh, sorry, Sarene." Also, I usually don't consider people who don't know me or don't even know who I am to be family. Not to mention, I personally had never been raised to think of such distant in-laws, or rather at that time, future in-laws, as, quote, family. I then turned to that woman and I said, well, he's not my family. An innocuous remark, or so I thought. A few days later, I got word that my future sister-in-law and her husband were livid that I had the audacity to refer to the husband's dad as someone who wasn't family. I don't remember the details of how this happened, but given how the chain of communication has operated in my husband's family for over the past 20 plus years, it probably went something like this. Someone at the party heard me refer to my future sister-in-law's husband's father as, quote, not my family, and decided to mention it to my fiance's sister and her husband. Given what happened to me in the coming days, I assume that my fiance's sister's husband went batshit over my perceived disrespect of his father. He likely then went off on my fiance's sister, who in turn contacted my fiance, who told me that his sister and her husband were deeply upset by my comment. Now, I wasn't privy to any of those conversations, but I do remember my fiance pressing me to smooth things over with his sister's husband. Something I can assure you he would never, ever ask me to do now. At the time, I was still just baffled over what I could have possibly done wrong. Just to give an example, my parents never considered the mothers and fathers of their siblings' spouses to be family. So why would I consider my future sister-in-law's husband's father to be my family? So I wound up emailing my fiance's sister's husband an apology that I'm sure was of the "I'm sorry if you were hurt" persuasion, because I didn't know what else to say at this point. But what happened next was something I never could have predicted. My fiance's sister's husband's response to my email was, to this day, the most vicious, traumatizing form of communication that I've ever experienced. I know this because I've blocked out 99% of what this man wrote to me. And I have an excellent memory. The only detail I can bear to remember, because it was just laughable, is how this man chastised me for not respecting his father simply because he was, quote, my elder. Yeah, sorry, dude, but I was raised in a non-patriarchal home where respect is earned and not automatic just because someone is old enough to join AARP. But what I do remember is how this man's vitriolic words made me feel frightened for my life. So much so that I called my fiance and begged him to leave work and come home. Again, this is something that I had never done before and never did since. Maybe one night when I was having a really bad time with our newborn, but this is not common. This is not common practice for me and my husband. I remember screaming and crying hysterically on the bathroom floor, feeling so unbelievably worthless that I even briefly contemplated suicide. My fiance, desperately trying to do damage control, leaped into action, berating his sister's husband for his outrageous behavior. But unfortunately, decades of my fiance being shoehorned into his family's peacemaker role resulted in somehow my fiance's sister's husband calling me at work so we could hash things out once and for all. This is a quick reminder that this was 2008 and everyone still called one another at inopportune times back then. Even though I kept telling this guy that this was not the right time or place to have this conversation, he bulldozed me into having a discussion that I also blocked out of my memory. Needless to say, we didn't come to any resolution because all this man wanted was a profuse apology for how rude I was to his father, which I wasn't, and for me to start considering him and his father to be my family. The only detail I do remember from this conversation is how this man said to me, as part of his argument that I should consider him and his father as my family, "When you have children, Sarene, won't I be their uncle?" It was enough to make my skin crawl. Here I was, less than 1 month before my wedding, and this guy was making my marriage about him. I remember that detail because ever since this incident and subsequent interactions, I made a solemn vow that this man would never, ever be considered my children's uncle. I don't let emotional and verbal abusers hold such honorifics when it comes to my child. I'm proud to say that my daughter does not consider this man to be her uncle, and in fact, she barely knows he exists. And I intend to keep it that way. Now, I want to say for the record that I do understand that some people think of everyone distantly related to them as family, and that's totally fine. But I wasn't raised to think that way, and that's okay too. Plus, what made this situation 10 times worse was how my husband's family never really welcomed me with open arms in the first place. And I get it. Here I was, a white privileged Jewish woman waltzing into my husband's Puerto Rican family. But the fact that I was chastised by people who barely treated me like family for not considering distant in-laws to be family, to this day, it still boggles my mind. Just because I don't think of distant relations or in-laws as family, it's no excuse to be treated like garbage just for having different beliefs. Unfortunately, there has never been any real resolution to what happened between me and my sister-in-law's husband back in 2008. Over the years, however, my husband and I have been able to avoid this man for the most part. Years of therapy have taught me that my sister-in-law's husband emotionally and verbally abused me, and if I don't want to have anything to do with him, and if I don't want my daughter to have anything to do with him, I am perfectly within my right. Another reason why we've blocked this man from our lives is because he would always find an opportunity to make anti-Semitic remarks towards me, in the guise of a joke, of course. No matter the occasion, my sister-in-law's husband would, without fail, always ask me before we sat down to a meal if the food was kosher. My husband's family is Puerto Rican and Catholic. Trust me, the food wasn't kosher. But the fact that this guy felt the need to single me out every time we had a meal made me sick inside. There is a lot more to this story, but it's not mine to tell. I'm grateful that I haven't seen my sister-in-law's husband in several years and that he's, for all intents and purposes, not a part of our world anymore. He has always frightened me, and I never want his unsettling presence in my life or my daughter's life ever again. I decided to tell this story on the podcast because, well, after 16 years, I remain alone in my fear, sadness, and hurt. Yes, I've discussed my sister-in-law's husband in therapy at length, but I really have no one else to talk to about my feelings. My husband never wants to hear about his brother-in-law because understandably it's too painful for him. I also get the same reaction from my own family members. Don't waste your time thinking about someone who's not worth your energy. That last part is true, but I have always felt that secrets ultimately hurt, not help people. The more we keep these stories hidden, the more we destroy ourselves. We need to tell these upsetting stories, not sweep them under the rug. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you are not alone. and there is help out there for those who need it. Thank you for listening to my story today on Emotional Abuse is Real. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out via email at hello@sereneleadswrites.com, through Instagram at sereneleadswrites, or fill out my guest application form. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and go grab my free download, 10 Things I Learned from Getting Paid to Watch TV. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.